using outside sources. So when we integrate sources and when we're referring to outside sources in a research type of essay, we are going to either be using quotations or paraphrasing works, and we'll be using in-text citations as well as a works cited page to refer to those works that we're discussing, okay? So let's jump right into this. First of all, the importance of paraphrasing. So you might not be familiar with this term, but a paraphrase is simply a restatement in your own words of somebody else's idea. So when you do research and you come across an idea or some new knowledge that you like, and then you put it into your own words, that's called paraphrasing. So the problem lies when you do that and you don't change enough of the original content, okay? Or that can be one instance of plagiarism. Or it also might be plagiarism if you simply have forgotten to attribute that borrowed idea to the original source. So I'll give you an example of what both of those instances would look like. So paraphrasing material is usually shorter than the original source. So usually when you're paraphrasing, what you're doing is you're condensing a broader segment of a source and saying it in a more succinct and concise way. And the best paraphrasing will emphasize the most relevant points and leaving out less critical information. So bear this in mind, and I say this to all of my students. When you are paraphrasing something, that means when you are using an idea in your paper or referring to information that you learned through the course of your research, anything that you learned in research in this process that you did not already know, you have to paraphrase it. Okay, not doing that is considered plagiarism. So you have to cite it. That means you have to indicate where you found that information and attribute it to the proper source, the author, and the page, or title of the article, or the web source, depending on the information that's available to you. Okay? So a good paraphrase, an effective paraphrase, a paraphrase that's not plagiarized must always be cited and attributed to the source. So here are a few sample student paraphrases. There's no attribution or citation here. This is just for example's sake. So notice these three sets that we have, A, B, A, B, A, and B. So in the first A, B set, we have the original. Let's say this is from the outside source. It stated, the still waters of the Caribbean water were teal in color. Then our student comes along and says, okay, I should probably put this idea into my own words because I don't want to use a direct quote, so I'm going to paraphrase it. So the student says, the turquoise Caribbean waters were calm. Now, if I asked you to give thumbs up or thumbs down to this, if I was to say, is it different? Is the student really making this idea their own? Are they changing things around? Is it an original thought? Those are all questions you want to ask when considering whether something is an effective paraphrase. Now, all the student notice has done here is change around two adjectives. They've switched out turquoise for teal and calm for still. So the idea really isn't theirs. So they would need to certainly attribute this to the source that they got it from. And more importantly, they should simply just use the original line, because changing around a couple of words in a sentence, but more or less copying the idea, is technically still considered plagiarism. So if you're going to paraphrase something, you have to change around the structure of the whole idea and really say it in your own original way. Number two, A and B set is a better example of this. So the original states, the price of a resort vacation includes meals, tips, and equipment rentals, which makes your trip cost effective. So it's long, it's kind of clunky, it's just a lot for one sentence. The student has paraphrased that here in their own words and in their own way, stating, all-inclusive resort vacations make for a very economical trip. So you notice the difference. It's expressing the same sentiment, but in an entirely original way. So this would be an example of a good paraphrase. A paraphrase, nonetheless, that would still need to be cited. And I'll show you examples of what that citation could look like. Last set, we have A and B. This was the original source. Uploading a video to YouTube can help exposure for your business versus posting a clip on YouTube can assist you build your business. So again, notice how similar those sources are. Similar verbs, posting versus uploading, assist you build versus help exposure for your business. So the structure of the sentence is very similar. There are synonyms being used to express the same thing. So in those cases, I would always advise the student, please just use the same original quote. If you cannot say it better than the original author said it, just use that original source and use a direct quote around it. Okay, so when you do use quotations, they must be identical to the original. And typically you're not quoting like a whole paragraph. You're quoting some small segment of the source. You're quoting one sentence or even a snippet, a phrase or a clause in a sentence. Don't think you have to quote an entire sentence. When you do quote, it must match the source document word for word, and you must give attribution to the original author. In other words, you must give the author credit, saying, this is who wrote this is who said this, and this is where they said this. And you give attribution through an in-text citation. So what is an in-text citation? Well, a citation is a signpost, so it basically points your reader in the right direction in terms of where they might find more information about your source, and it also acknowledges your source. So it reveals you are essentially indebted to that source, that you owe that source something. So the in-text citations that I refer to are called in-text because they're occurring within the body of the text itself. Sometimes you'll see that citations also take the form of footnotes when they appear at the bottom of the page or the end of the paper. Now for our purposes, for our class and the formats we're learning, and for most traditional MLA formatted essays that you'll write in college, you would need to know how to use in-text citations. So notice here, let's say that you use the source of a lecture, and I said citations are very important. Okay, Johnson, this was my maiden name, so let's change that to Curtis, but just pretend, okay? And then you would have cited this source correctly because you're giving credit to who said it. Now, there is no page number in this case, so if there's no page number, for instance, you are referring to a source that was a video lecture, or you're referring to a source that was a web source where there are no page numbers because it's a website without pages, or you're referring to a quote from a podcast, again with no page numbers, you can just use the last name for your attribution. So this is a sample of 3 different ways that we might give credit to a quote and what that corresponding entry would look like on the works cited page. So here we have some ideas about Wordsworth, a poet from the Romantic period. And our first sentence, notice, states that Wordsworth stated that Romantic poetry was marked by a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So you end the quote, you insert the page number, and then you place the period at the end of this unit of the in-text citation. Let's compare that to the second one. Romantic poetry is characterized by the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So the quote is exactly the same, however, notice the difference in the in-text citation. Here we have the page number, here we simply have, or that's simply the page number here, and here we have the author's last name and page number in the in-text citation. So take a guess as to why this might be the case, and ding, 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 you might have gotten it right. We notice here that the author's last name is already mentioned in the body of the sentence. So in our in-text citation, all we need to do is attribute the source using a page number. Now, if you don't mention the author's name specifically in the body of the sentence, you would do that here. You always want to indicate who said it, and if possible, where they said it. So these are examples of direct quotes. The last one is a paraphrase. So the student has taken this idea and placed it entirely into their own words, although they borrowed the idea. It wasn't their own original idea. They borrowed it from what they read. That's where they got the idea. They stated that Wordsworth extensively explored the role of emotion in the creative process. So a great paraphrase. Again, they've already mentioned Wordsworth. They don't need to be redundant and state his name again, so they just state the page number. Now, on the works cited page that appears at the very end of their essay, this would be the corresponding entry. Okay, so basically in text, you are being directed to the works cited page, so if the reader's like, hey, I want to read this piece by Wordsworth because I want to build on this research the student did, or I want to verify some of these sources because this is interesting, then your reader knows where exactly they can turn to get more information on your topic. Here's another example. So this was our original source, all right? This would be how it would appear on the works cited page, except it would be double-spaced, okay? So if the essay provides a signal phrase, that means the author's last name, as I already mentioned. The citation does not also need to include the author's last name. So just really another example of the same thing that I already mentioned. So we say Kenneth Burke here. We don't need to say Burke here. Here we do not mention Kenneth Burke. So we need to attribute the quote to who said it. So here's something that often happens with student essays. Students will paraphrase something and they'll think, well, I'm really just, kind of synthesizing everything I learned and I'm putting it into my own words, so I don't need to give credit. So that's wrong, okay? This would be really wrong in this case because this is a direct quote and there are no quotations around it and there's no attribution. So no, big X through this one because this is straight out plagiarism if you just copy a line directly and you don't give any credit. Now this is how you would do it. This is a quote from Plato. So you might indicate Plato said blank 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 on page 25 and text citation period, or it has been said that books do X, Y, and Z, and then because we didn't already attribute it to Plato, we mentioned Plato page 25 here. So when you're thinking about questions to consider as you're working on your in-text citations, putting on the finishing touches, think about this. Can your readers find your exact source with the information you've provided on the works cited page and within the in-text citations that lead them to the correct sources on your works cited page? Also, crucially important, have you accurately indicated which words and ideas are yours and which words and ideas are somebody else's? This is important because when you cite somebody else's idea, you're honoring those who came up with the idea. If you don't give them credit, you're basically violating the rights of the person who came up with that idea in the first place, kind of like stealing it and saying, oh, I thought of this. This was my idea, when it wasn't. And then when you get into more advanced research, let's say you're in a graduate school level doing some original research in a PhD program and you're publishing stuff that other people are building upon, it would allow other scholars to trace the origins of ideas and how they developed across time. So one other thing I want to show you guys that it's important for integrating quotations is a pretty basic concept. So forgive the sort of simplicity of the illustration, although I think that it's really helpful. So we have this model here, and when you have a quote that you are embedding into an essay, imagine that you are creating a quote sandwich, and it needs to have 3 different components of it. So to ensure that your reader fully understands how the quote you are using supports your thesis, you need to do a few different things. You need to, first of all, smoothly integrate the quote into the paragraph. And you also need to explain why you're including that quote in such a way that the reader understands how it helps to support your thesis. So these are the 3 components of the so-called quote sandwich. And I would use this with all levels of my English courses, from my 47A to my 105 and 205 classes, because this is just something that it's not necessarily common sense. And I think this illustration can be really useful. So you never want to just plop a quote down in the middle of writing between a couple of different sentences. So for instance, you never want to write a sentence, period, then include a quote with a source attribution, period, and then move on to your next sentence without introducing that quote. So you want to set up a quote by using some kind of introductory clause or phrase. Okay, and I'll post along with this video a little reference tool, like a handout that has more in-depth information on how you can do this. So you might say something like, the article explains that, and then include the quote. Or the author explains that, or author X asserts that, okay? So you introduce the quote with that signal phrase or a verb, what is the author or article doing, and then you place the quote after it. And don't forget to cite the quote itself. Once you do that, you then need to explain what the quote means and why it matters. So how does it connect to the topic sentence? Reminding readers of how all of this is logically created, or how this is all logically connected. How does it connect all the way back to your thesis? And the explanation should be at least as long, ideally longer than the quote itself. So again, 3 parts of a quotation that you're integrating into your essay. You must properly introduce the quote, include the quotation with a proper citation, and then explain what the quote means before you just move on. Now I want to just briefly give you guys a couple examples of what that might actually look like, so the mistakes that you'd want to avoid. So let's say that for the sake of this example, I'm coming up with a sentence here, and I say, dogs are excellent pets. Dogs are likely to help us live longer. Cats are also fun to have around. Okay, there's just so many problems with this block of text here. So notice a couple things. In terms of this quotation sandwich model, is this quote properly introduced? No. Do we see how this idea connects logically to the topic sentence, trying to prove that dogs are excellent pets? No. The writer assumes that we'll understand the connection, and after stating the quote, they simply move on to another thought. So the whole effect is to make this seem very disorganized. So first of all, we need to introduce the quote. So we have our topic sentence, very simplistic, but this is just for example's sake. So let's just make something up, which you would never do for your research paper, but I'll do this for an example. According to scholar, so you can be more specific. The more specific you can be, the better. According to veterinary scholar Joshua Jones, dogs are likely to help us live longer, and we forgot also an in-text citation, and Joshua Jones said this on page 35 of the article that we supposedly found for our research. So now we've corrected a couple things. We have included an introduction to the quote, so it's not just floating around there in the middle of this text. We have included an in-text citation properly with the format of end the quote, open parentheses, include the attribution, end the parentheses, place the period here on the outside. So the period doesn't go here, there's no period here, there's no commas in here. And remember guys, for MLA we're not doing page numbers, or excuse me, we're not doing dates, we're doing only page numbers, okay? So the last part of this quote sandwich would be an explanation of how this source quote helps to prove our point. Dogs are likely to help us live longer. We would probably want to expand on this idea by using another source because this is a synthesis essay. So one study found that dogs lower blood pressure, increase memory, and raise levels of serotonin, which is the brain's feel-good chemical that helps combat depression. Let's say this was found, Kathy Burke said this on page 5 of her essay, okay? So we need to explain what all this information means now. So we might say something like, clearly, there are many health benefits to owning a pet dog that will improve the owner's quality of life, ultimately leading to not only more years of life, but also better lived years of life. So not only are you living longer, but the years you're living are better because of a dog, according to this student. Okay, now you would want to wrap up this idea by providing a little bit of your own analysis and commentary, connecting it back to some overall points so we understand the significance overall of why this matters. And then this idea about cats are fun to have around. I don't know if this belongs in this essay. This is an essay that is arguing that everybody should own a pet.